Hello there everyone. I just want to say right off the bat that if you're having a good day today and you're in a good mood, I'd recommend coming back to this video at another time because the subject matter that we're going to deal with today is quite heavy and it's very tragic. So yeah, if you're in a good frame of mind and you don't want that spoiled by me, then please come back another time when you're in the mood for it. For everybody else though, what I want to do today is I want us to go through a chapter of a book together. It's The Divided Self by R.D. Laing, who I made a video on a few weeks ago. And this book has made a big impact on me, not only because it's fascinating and it's original in its insights, but also how moving it is in its recounts of people who exist with this splitting in their sense of selfhood, people with conditions like schizoid and schizophrenia, like the ones that we're going to look at today. And a part of this book's power largely stems from its writer. R.D. Laing speaks less like a clinical expert and more like a philosopher because he goes beyond the technical descriptions of these conditions and he grounds them in an existential context. And what that does is it succeeds in bridging a gap between us and them, and it gets us to empathise with the perspectives of those living with it. An essential part of what I do with XELASOMA is I try to find new ways of communicating what we are as humans, because sometimes I think that we behave like we forgot we're human. And that's part of our schism. That's our disconnect, is that modern society has made it so we're all trying to find or restore some form of lost connection. And the real tragedy is sometimes human lives have to be so broken to communicate back to our lives about what we are as an integrated entity. And so with that being said, I think that we should really just crack on with this because even though it's going to be a rough ride, it's going to be worth it. Let's imagine mental harmony as a clear, still lake. And imagine that we could go up to that lake and drop a pebble into it, creating all of these splashes and ripples in the water. And what that shows to us is that by disrupting its equilibrium, we're exposed to the wider dynamics of its nature. And many of us experience ourselves like a lake that's never had a big pebble thrown into it. So our appreciation of life as a subject with an integrated sense of self always rests in conformity with the habitual states that we're normalized to. And in one sense, that's a good thing because we only need to be in those states to do most of what we need to do in life. But by the same token, only being in those states yields a limited perspective of what we truly are. Crisis is like a pebble that can reveal to us the greater dynamism of our mental architecture, and that's precisely what I want us to take away from this. I want us to really understand that people with schizophrenia are not so removed from us. In fact, they are us. They're just operating at a different order of calibration, so to speak. Alright, so let's get into the book then. The case that we're going to be dealing with describes the life of a young girl named Julie, who first came to the attention of R.D. Laing when she was admitted to hospital with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. She was 17 at the time of admission to hospital. R.D. Laing writes, quote, "In these years she had become a typical, inaccessible and withdrawn chronic schizophrenic. She was hallucinated, given to posturing, to stereotyped, bizarre, incomprehensible actions. She was mostly mute, and when she did speak, it was in the most deteriorated schizophrenies." End quote. Yeah, schizophrenies, this is a term that they use to describe the chaotic and disorganized speech patterns that we sometimes see in schizophrenics. And I'll just upload a short video clip here so that you can have a demonstration of what that's actually like.
Like the halo, see, like the halo, when I was 19, when I was a preacher, and I had my trial sermon, I used to see a little light over my shadow on the ground in the daytime. And then now, ever since then, it's like a light coming further down over my body, around my shadow. It's over my body, but around my shadow, and I see the light, which is your halo, I mean your aura. And that's why everybody can't see that. But if you see, you got something to do with the drugs too, we say. And now I don't know what's for real. I know what I see, but I don't know if it's for real or not.
Schizophrenia is classified under a variety of subtypes. The subtype that Julie was awarded was a Hebephrenic. This is also sometimes referred to as disorganized schizophrenia. People with this subset are primarily characterized by the disorganization of thought and speech, and also the hallucinations which people commonly associate with schizophrenia are less pronounced in Hebephrenics than in other subsets. Returning to a quote from the book then, quote, "Left to herself, there is little doubt she would quickly have become physically entirely dilapidated, but her outward appearance was maintained by the almost daily attentions of her mother." End quote. The mother's involvement in this case will become a lot more clear quite soon, and understanding the family dynamic in general is going to be instrumental in understanding how Julie got this way. Alright, so now we've been introduced to this case, I want to read another quote from the book which is talking about the characteristic symptoms that was observed in Julie. Quote, "In her interview with the psychiatrist, he recorded that there was nothing particularly unusual about her non-verbal behaviour in itself, but that the things she said were enough to establish the diagnosis of schizophrenia. In clinical psychiatric terminology, she suffered from depersonalization, derealization, autism, nihilistic delusions, delusions of persecution, omnipotence, end-of-the-world fantasies, auditory hallucinations, and impoverishment of affects." End quote. Alright, so let's go through each of these characteristics then to understand what they mean. Depersonalization. Depersonalization is where we lose contact with our ability to distinguish a proper sense of selfhood. So this is very central to what we're going to be talking about with Julie. Derealization. This is connected somewhat to this lacking inability to distinguish a sense of self, except instead this is felt at the level of the world. The integrity of the external world is questioned. It becomes unreal or derealized. On a little side note, I've always wondered whether this ability of humans to experience derealization might be at the root of certain religious cosmologies like Gnosticism, which posits that the material world is an imposter world, and that the true reality can only be found by escaping the trappings of this imposter world and finding our way back to the source of authentic reality. I might talk about religious stuff as well towards the end of the video, though for now let's just go through with some of these symptoms. When it refers to autism, I don't know what he means by this. He doesn't go into any detail about what she means by autism and Julie. Nihilistic delusions, we'll get onto that. Delusions of persecution, these self-explanatory really. This largely emanates from the relationship that she had with her mother, which we will again explain as things go on. Omnipotence. Oh, alright, so yeah, we often find this in psychotic individuals where in one moment they feel completely impotent and feel like they're being predated on by reality, the ultimate victims in a sense. And then in contrast to this, perhaps even born out of that impotence, we also find this omnipotent stance of believing that they have special powers or a privilege that has been granted to them by God to see the hidden aspects of the universe that only they can see. And again, let's look at this video clip here for an example of that.
Well, I think of Christ suffering on the cross? Or someone suffering? Am I suffering?
You're always suffering.
Because I think that I'm God. And that I'm going to, by being a schizophrenic and going through this hell, it's making the new world.
So we should be able to see how this ties into the derealization effect. As the integrity of ordinary reality becomes more and more untenable, it not only becomes terrifying for the person who's experiencing it, it also engages with our innate capacity for magical thinking to put forward the idea that we might be seeing reality for what it truly is. And perhaps we do this as a countermeasure of reassurance to mitigate the anxiety from reality deforming all around us. This style of thinking can also become incorporated into a process that we call narratization, where our mind synthesizes important features of our experience into a constructed narrative, and that helps us to reconcile our minds to the events in a way. We all do this, not just schizophrenics, and it's not innately pathological in itself. It's the foundation of all myth-making and storytelling, after all. But how this plays into the psychosis is important because it offers clues to understanding these conditions and how these people got this way. Okay then, so proceeding on with some of the other symptoms. Apocalyptic fantasies and auditory hallucinations, I mean, they're pretty self-explanatory. We don't need to really explain what they are. I think that most people understand that. Impoverishment of affect, however, we do need to explain this one. So this is a retardation in the ability to express emotionality. This is where we get this deadpanning effect in their tone and body language, and this deadpanning of reflexivity can also carry over into stimuli, like where we see someone waving a hand over someone's eyes to get a reaction and they're not moving. Some specialists posit that this flat effect may be a defense mechanism that obfuscates the individual's true feelings, not only from the therapist who's trying to access them, but also from the individual themselves as well. If the information is too distressful, then the psyche can firewall that away behind an iron curtain of unresponsiveness. And that unresponsiveness is submitted to automatically because, remember, the will to command their own behaviour has been so thoroughly deteriorated, so they fall very easily to persuasions both from within and without. I had a fall in 2001. I fell over a 15-foot drop and I broke my fibula and tibia in my left leg, and I also landed with my spine on the curb of the road, which fractured it a bit. And I remember not being able to move at all until the ambulance came and collected me. And I told that to the doctor. And the doctor said, yeah, that's actually quite a common thing, because what sometimes happens is if you do damage to your spine, your body has this automatic defense mechanism that it can engage where it kind of temporarily paralyzes you to prevent you moving around and twisting your spine and potentially doing any more damage to it. And so I just wanted to include that in there just to show that there are lots of these innate defense mechanisms, or firewalls as I called them, that sometimes get engaged in physical ailments but also in psychological ailments as well. And also the emotional fallout that we were talking about can also be united to the effects of depersonalization and derealization. The more estranged we are from the world and from ourselves, the more that we lose touch with the original vitality that made the world feel alive in the first place, and we begin to sense the world as being dead, empty, mechanical, robotic. And I know that we haven't got really deep into this case just yet, but I think it's worth saying anyway that all of this illustrates something very important. That being the interdependent relationship of our systems. That a deterioration in one area of our operation can translate into another effect at another level. We can't really look at the human in a mechanical, reductive sense. We have to appreciate ourselves more like how we appreciate an ecosystem, as a dynamic, interdependent system of exchanges that in very subtle ways modulate and influence each other. And even though we might experience ourselves in the here and now as a unified system, we are only that way in the same way as our body is unified together by fibres and strands of tissue. And those tissues can be cut or deteriorate so badly that it brings disharmony to the entire system. In other words, we shouldn't take the integrated nature of our arrangement for granted because, I suppose to put things more simply, if something can come together, then it can also become undone. And now we get to the first real clue to Julie's psychosis. And listen very closely because it's quite simple what she says, though it's really important to understand her story. Quote, "She said the trouble was that she was not a real person. She was trying to become a person." I'll say that again. She said the trouble was that she was not a real person. She was trying to become a person. She felt unreal, and there was an invisible barrier between herself and others. She was empty and worthless. She was worried lest she was too destructive and was beginning to think it best not to touch anything in case she caused damage. She had a great deal to say about her mother. She was smothering her. She would not let her live, and she had never wanted her. Now that point of being afraid of touching things in case she broke them was very telling. When a life is split off from its ordinary sense of the world of objects and the inner world of its own subject, the boundaries between the tangible world and the self get muddled up. So, in other words, something that can happen on the outside can get mistranslated and rationalized as having happened internally. So, if I'm a schizophrenic and I'm carrying a glass of water and I accidentally drop it onto the floor and it smashes, I could re-rationalize that event as having significance at the center of my being, and I'd complain to the doctor and say, "I've hurt myself, I've broken my bones are on the floor." So from these statements, we should be able to see all of this coming together now. She felt unreal. There's the depersonalization. There was an invisible barrier between herself and others. There's the derealization. She was empty and worthless. There's the nihilism. She said that she was being smothered by her mother. There's the feelings of persecution. And then there's this. Quote, "The basic psychotic statement she made was that a child had been murdered." End quote. This statement from Julie about a child being murdered is central to understanding Julie's existential condition. She also said that this came from the voice of her brother, but the thing is, she never had a brother to begin with. So, it's this voice phenomenon, in addition to all of the other criteria, is how we know that we're dealing with an individual in a psychotic state. And what we're going to do now is look back at Julie's upbringing, and I think that you'll be surprised about how things which might not seem on face value that extreme could lead to the collapse of a person's entire sense of being. Alright then, so let's learn about Julie's backstory. She lived with her father, mother, and one older sister, and she also had an aunt who saw her regularly. This is the social cosmos, as it were, that Julie was situated in leading up to her admission into hospital. So, how did these people generally think of Julie? R.D. Laing writes, quote, "Although each of the various people interviewed had his or her own point of view on Julie's life, they all agreed in seeing her life in three basic states or phases. Namely, there was a time when the patient was a good, normal, healthy child, until she gradually began to be bad, or do or say things that caused great distress, and which were on the whole put down to naughtiness or badness, until this went beyond all tolerable limits, so that she could only be regarded as completely mad. So there are the 3 phases of development: good, bad, and mad. And this is a statement from the mother herself about Julie's so-called bad phase. Quote, "I was beginning to hate the terrible things she said to me, but then I saw that she couldn't help it. She was such a good girl. Then she started to say awful things. If only we had known. Were we wrong to think that she was responsible for what she said? I knew that she really could not have meant the awful things that she said to me. In a way, I blame myself, but in a way, I'm glad that it was an illness after all. But if only I had not waited so long before I took her to a doctor." End quote. This befuddlement is very common to most families who go through this kind of thing. No one gives us a training manual on how to be a human, let alone how to handle something like a psychosis. However, this lack of her parents' ability to read into Julie's plight is actually key as to why things got this bad in the first place. So now we have to ascertain how this migration through the 3 phases occurred and actually figure out what these categories mean in the context of this familial relationship. Quote, "Julie acted in such a way as to appear to her parents to be everything that was right. She was good, healthy, and normal. Then her behaviour changed so that she acted in terms of what all the significant others in her world unanimously agreed was bad, until a short while she was mad." End quote. So what we might take on face value as a simple testimony contains more meaning to the eye of a psychiatrist like R.D. Laing. In fact, I think that what psychiatrists and police detectives and philosophers have in common, and maybe mystics as well in a somewhat different sense, is that they never take anything on face value. They all operate under the persuasion that sometimes what people say has deeper connotations than even the people who are saying it might realize to themselves. Language is pregnant with meaning, and though we might think that we use language sensibly and in alignment with the facts, this betrays other factors like how the way that we speak communicates something about our personality, or Freudian slips are another good example. We think that we're communicating cogently and clearly, and then out of the blue, we utter something that speaks to something else. Language isn't linear, it's often symbolic of other things, and this was definitely the case with Julie's family. So what they saw in Julie as the product of being a good girl was precisely the messaging that something was going wrong here, and the parents' implication in the cultivation of that goodness set up the devastating events which came later on. And in the next few passages we're going to see the darker undertones of this goodness. Quote, "Julie was never a demanding baby. She was weaned without difficulty. Her mother had no bother with her from the day she took off nappies completely when she was 15 months old. She was never a trouble. She always did what she was told. She never really cried for her feeds. She never sucked vigorously. She never finished a bottle. She did not put on weight very rapidly. She never wanted for anything, but I felt that she was never satisfied." These are the mother's basic generalizations in support of the view that Julie was always a good child. End quote. And I think a lot of parents these days would want for a baby like that, right? One who didn't cry that much, one who didn't resist and be too much bother. Well, let's hear what R.D. Laing has to say about this. Quote, "This is the description of a child who has in some way never come alive. For a really alive baby is demanding, is a trouble, and by no means always does what she is told. It may well be that the baby was never as perfect as the mother would like me to believe, but what is highly significant is that it is just this goodness which is the mother's ideal of what perfection is in a baby. The crucial thing seems to me to be that the mother evidently takes just those things which I take to be expressions of an inner deadness as expressions of the utmost goodness, health, and normalcy. The whole family system of relationships of which Julie was a part is not that her mother, father, and aunt all describe an existentially dead child, but that none of the adults in her world know the difference between existential life and death. On the contrary, being existentially dead receives the highest commendation from them. End quote. So this low-level receptivity at such a young age is not an indication of good behaviour. It's actually an indication that something might be going wrong inside that child. We see this all the time with conditions like autism. A baby is born and it's relatively quiet, it seems quite docile, and the parents interpret this as a positive sign because the baby isn't that much trouble, it's not keeping them up all night, it's not giving them too much of a mither, until the child develops to be just a bit older, and then they find all these other problems like it can't communicate properly, or it can't integrate properly in social environments, or it goes into rages and so on, and then it gets given a diagnosis of autism. So yeah, we see all this kind of thing all the time. Now, granted, the family that we're talking about here aren't trained to see things in the way that a psychiatrist might notice them. So on one level, it's understandable that they reacted in the way that they did, but it's in the details of their parental approach, especially so in the mother, that exacerbated things beyond repair. In the book, R.D. Laing describes this child as someone who is biologically alive, but is having problems in becoming existentially alive. Remember what Julie said in her original complaint, that she didn't feel like a real person and that she was trying to become a real person. And I like that phrasing because it indicates that what we are biologically is not the be-all and end-all of the matter, not where the living of a human life is concerned at least, and that we have other components to our dynamic that may or may not be wedded to that biology, yet they're nonetheless imperative for an integrated, healthy existence. And if there's a significant deterioration at one of the levels of those systems, then the integrity of that integrated existence falls apart. And it's because of this family's failure to see anything wrong in a baby who hardly cries, who doesn't satisfy itself properly, or doesn't wean, or doesn't seem to want for anything. It's in that absence of recognition for this unusual behaviour that's the first real warning sign for us. That, and the fact that the family equates this behaviour with their idea of goodness. So we're gradually starting to build up a portrait of a scene. However, some of the key features haven't quite been fleshed out yet. So now let's listen to how this is contrasted in the way that Julie's sister was raised. Quote, Julie's sister had never been a demanding, greedy baby. Her mother had never had much hope for her. I just let her go her own way, she said. However, it was just the fact that Julie from the start had never been demanding that seemed largely to have encouraged her mother to give her so much. It was therefore a terrible thing for her when in her teens Julie, instead of displaying some gratitude for all that had been done for her and given to her, began to accuse her mother of never having let her be, End quote. Julie obviously had some kind of dysfunction from birth, and her mother played into that by smothering her. And this contributed to the statement where Julie complained that her mother never allowed her to be. She was never allowed to actuate her autonomy and become her own person in a way. Quote, "The combination of almost total failure of the baby to achieve self-instinctual gratification, along with the mother's total failure to realize this, can be noted as one of the recurrent themes in the early beginnings of the relation of mother to schizophrenic child." End quote. What's also very interesting here is where R.D. Laing starts talking about the ways that humans engage a child's development as a game, like walking, for example. The first time that we learn to walk, we're obviously not going to be that good at it, though we are propelled by this impetus to try and walk, and our parents help us with that by stabilizing us somewhat and giving us, I suppose, like little obstacle courses, for lack of a better way of thinking about it. Simple things to climb over and navigate around. And when we're successful, the parent offers positive reaffirmation in that game. So we turn our juvenile development into a series of games, and when we play those games, we not only take part in our development, but more prominently, and this is the big part, we begin to actualize ourselves in life. And that activity provides the basis for our existential quality of being in the world. While we're here, let's think about another game. Have you ever seen a baby who's had something in their hand, like a toy or a rattle or something, and they drop it onto the floor? And then the parent picks it up for them, and they keep dropping it on the floor again. Well, that's another part of our development, because think about it like this. By dropping something that was once in your hands and having returned to us again, this is the first time we ever get to experience another human being colluding with us in a reciprocal action. And by doing that, our parents collude with us to maintain an impression that we are in control. So if you have kids and your baby's doing that, don't just try and force it into its hands and say, keep it in the hands. It's doing that for a reason. Like, this is the first time that the brain has ever experienced something like this. And the reason why it can seem somewhat illogical to us as adults is because we're already arriving at that from an already integrated position. We've already dropped the object and have it returned to us over and over again. The baby hasn't. This is the first time that it's experiencing some kind of collusion with another human being, and it's something that they feel that they have the first sense of a control over. So don't just force it into its hand. Play the game, because as a parent, you're cultivating its existential basis. It's like a video game. It's gaining experience points, and you're helping it level up. So what might seem to us as integrated adults, like trivial events, should not be taken for granted, because they are our foundation. And when we interact with young children in this way, we're not simply playing a silly game or preparing them for the workplace in some bullshit utilitarian sense. We're taking part in the actualization of a human identity. I remember reading a Buddhist analogy many years ago, and it was talking about spiritual development and how they'd get all these young pupils to the temple, and these people are really eager. They've got all kinds of idealized, romantic notions of what living in the temple is going to be like and how brilliant they're going to become after they've done all their training. And when they get there, they just want to dive right into all of the really, esoteric stuff, all of the really deep philosophy, or all the advanced kind of meditational techniques and all this kind of stuff. And they don't realize that, You've got to graduate to that. You can't just dive right in and get a shortcut to the good stuff. And the way that this monk was allegorizing it is he was saying it was like a temple with a series of steps going up to the top where the shrine was. And if we want to get to the top where the shrine is, we don't just teleport all the way to the top or maybe jump halfway up to the steps and cut out a load of that process. No, we have to step on the first step. And then we have to step on the second step. And then we have to step on the third, and so on and so forth, and migrate gradually in a step-by-step process to the top of the shrine. And think about it in another way as well. The only reason why we can stand on the top by that shrine is because all of those previous steps are there supporting us. And our organism is like that. Our psychology is like that. It isn't just a given thing. Part of it is hereditary, part of it comes as a byproduct of millions of years of adaptation and evolutionary development, though a lot of it as well has been cultivated through a series of games and interactions that we've forgotten about because it happened so earlier on in life. And from the moment that Julie was born, she was effectively denied this by the constant intrusiveness of her mother, who instead of spending a bit more time practicing these life skills with her, chose to simply commandeer her own daughter's autonomy and do everything for her. And that meant that Julie was effectively deprived of the essential experiences of ever knowing that she could be in control of her own actions. And by extension, that meant that her self-identity never crystallized. Now we're starting to understand why she said that she was trying to become a person. Julie was trying to become a person because all of the prerequisites to becoming a person, like freedom, autonomy, self-actualization, had been outsourced to another agency. She had effectively been a putty moulded by her mother's hand all of her life, and therefore she never found the freedom to take her own shape. Now we get to the so-called bad phase, as her parents called it. Remember to keep in mind that all that they deemed as good in Julie was precisely the circumstance that we've just described in the previous segment. Julie was good when she was being a compliant automaton, and now in her later years this converts into an inner rage which is directed back at her parents. Quote, "She had a spell at about the age of 10 when she had to be told everything that was going to happen in the course of the day and what she was to do. If her mother refused to comply with this ritual, she would start to whimper. Nothing would stop this whimpering, according to her mother, but a sound thrashing. As she grew older, she would not use any money she was given herself. Even when encouraged to say what she wanted, or to buy a dress for herself, or to have friends like the other girls, she would not express her own wishes. She had to have her mother to buy her clothes, and she showed no initiative in making friends. She would never take a decision of any kind. She bit and tore at her nails, and from the first beginnings of speech, she had a tendency to turn words back to front. Her mother, however, discounted such things as transitory phases. One has in them, nevertheless, sudden glimpses of an inner world of violent destructiveness, with a short-lived desperate access of manifest greed, which, however, soon became curbed and submerged again." End quote. So when Julie got to the age of 15, this dynamic started to change for everybody involved. The mother suddenly decided that Now was the time for Julie to just go out into the world and start making friends, because after a lifetime of corroding all of her natural instinct for self-autonomy and self-identity, which are the prerequisites of going out into the world and forming bonds with other human beings, of course this would all just happen naturally on its own, right? It's like forcing a dog's head under the water from the time that it was a puppy, and then expecting it to swim in the river. Well, what's wrong with the stupid dog? Why is it afraid of just a bit of water? These people are absolutely incredible. Returning to the book then, quote, "Whereas previously she had thought it right and proper that Julie should be with her as much as possible, now she began to urge her to get out more, have friends, go to the pictures, and even to dances and have boyfriends. All of these things the patient obstinately refused to do. Instead, she would sit and do nothing, or wander the streets, never telling her mother when she would be back. She kept her room extravagantly untidy." And this is where we get back to the original complaint. Quote, "She would accuse her mother of not having wanted her, of not letting her be a person, of never having let her breathe, of having smothered her." End quote. So here we can see the emergence of new patterns forming. Teenagers usually go through a coming-of-age process where they try to assert their own identity against the will of their parents, and this is completely natural. It's part of the individual's breakaway from the parental influence. Julie's adolescent frustration stems from the fact that she has been raised from birth into a state of perpetual dependence, only to be later forced into independence without any of the life skills or the existential foundation to see that through. And her resentment about that is justified because her parents, especially so the mother, have not encouraged her or properly worked with her to work optimally in the world. Julie is existentially stuck between a rock and a hard place. She has no essential foundation with which to begin actualizing herself in life, and now finds herself in a situation where the artificial support network from the parents that has been maintaining her existence up until then has suddenly retracted its effect. What do you think that's going to do? I think we've done a really good job so far of painting a picture of this familial arrangement and also contextualizing our understanding of that with how the style of involvement which our parents choose to engage us with sets us up for what we become in life. And in a healthy situation, eventually, when we come to do things for ourselves, we can do so because they've helped us to actualize ourselves through games and programs that cultivate the necessary foundations within us that lead us on into maturity. Now we've built up a picture of this situation, we're getting closer to talking about Julie's psychosis. So I want us to listen to what R.D. Laing says about schizophrenia within the context of the family. Quote, "Schizophrenia is a possible outcome of a more than usual difficulty in becoming a whole person with the other, and in not sharing the common sense way of experiencing oneself in the world." Alright, so that's quite an interesting quote, so let's unpack this. When he's talking about a difficulty in being a whole person with the other, this other can mean another human being, but it can also mean another object in the world, like a lamp or a tree or a wall or an animal. It's the consistent ability to form a consistent representation of self-subject and world-object that is distorted in the schizophrenic psyche. In simpler terms, we might say that there's an internal confusion as to where the self ends and where the world begins. And in cases like this one with Julie, what we're seeing is a child that had not been initiated properly to really form those appropriate connections between a consistent view of self and the world of subject-object relations. As Laing puts it, schizophrenics do not share the common sense way of experiencing oneself in the world. And he also has a good way of describing the relationship between the child and parents in a typical familial system. Quote, "The world of the child, as of the adult, is a unity of the given and the constructed. The mother and father greatly simplify the world for the young child, and as his capacity grows to make sense, to inform chaos with pattern, to grasp distinctions and connections of greater and greater complexity, so he is led out into a feasible world." End quote. Yeah, so in other words, the family represents a microcosm of the complex world, and this sets the stage for our initiation into the world of complex affairs, so to speak. And the styles of approach that our parents employ that initiate us into that world space determines the styles of relationship that we will employ to interact with the wider world and the people in it. I made a video last year, if you remember, called The World Image, which was my way of describing this framework we create in our minds that filters life into an overall impression, and we use that impression to represent what the world is to ourselves, or what we think the world is to ourselves. So someone who was raped as a child might come to see the world as a space of predators, and so the predator becomes their world image. Or a venture capitalist might see the world as a space of investments and exchanges, and so the world image as opportunity becomes his world image, and so on. I also said in that video that one of the primary functions of religion was to step in and provide a comprehensive world image for large communities of people. But now, in the modern world, after our emancipation from community and religion, people are falling back on their own interpretive frameworks, so their world images are like chimeras that are pulled together by things like childhood experience, pop culture, our education or lack thereof, the level of propaganda that we've internalized, and so on. And I see this interaction between world space, as Lane described it, and world image, where we find life experience giving itself over to representation. And when we talk more about Julie's psychotic statements, we're going to see a lot of this imagery in her language. Just to pause for a bit of a breather for a second. I know that we're talking about some really abstract things here, but I think that what's really important to take away from this section is that we're learning about how becoming human is not just a given thing. We don't come ready-made for all of life's challenges and complexities. We have to be confronted and cultivated by multiple experiences. Now, the nascent processes that can facilitate that are already inside us, yes, but they have to be cultivated, like how a bonsai tree has to be cultivated. We have to provide all of those necessary elements, and then the innate processes within the plant can take over and germinate from the inside out. And if that's been a successful process, it can finally blossom in maturity. In Julie's life, all of these nascent processes have been outsourced to another agent. So what we're dealing with is a child that has never been able to self-actualize in the settings of its own familial microcosm. And so naturally, when it gets sent out into life, it doesn't know what to do because the nascent processes might be there, but they haven't been properly met with a life experience that's been allowed to flourish from the inside out. The entire arrangement has been outsourced. It's artificial. Not only this, but her nervous system has come to predicate its subject-to-object relationship in accordance with the mandates of this external agent, meaning that she doesn't have the same common sense way of experiencing herself in the world as we do. Julie's style of living in the world of impressions and forms and complexities is different to ours precisely because of the soils that she has grown up in. For almost 2 decades, her entire context for living was contingent on the presence of an external authority from which her psyche derived all of its sense of direction, world image, an existential basis. And to think this arrangement was maintained under a collusion by her parents, that the characteristics of this compliant, lifeless automaton represented all that was good about her character. Then when finally confronted with the real first inklings of resistance, that were in a sense the first real advertisements to the world that Julie had a flame of life in her, they just refused to take her complaint seriously, which just compounded the central issue that Julie didn't feel like she was a real person. The complexities of feeling like she was not really alive and authentic, coupled with the fact that there was no one in her world who could see any sense in her point of view, meant that she interpreted all of this circumstance as a matter of life and death. She was not merely aggressing to try and win an argument. She was fighting for her own existence. Now we know why when her parents reprimanded her for her bad behaviour, she felt this as an act of murder. Quote, "Her mother was prepared to accept a compliant false self, to love this shadow, and to give it anything. She even tried to order this shadow to act as though it were a person. But she had never recognised the real disturbing presence in the world of a daughter with her own possibilities. The existential truth in Julie's delusions was that her own true possibilities were being smothered, strangled, murdered." End quote. At the beginning of this analysis, we heard that after her admission into hospital, Julie had said that a child had been murdered. This statement was also a factor that awarded her with the diagnosis of schizophrenia. Now we're going to find out why. So now we're nearing the conclusion of this analysis, and we've got to look at the actualities of Julie's psychosis. But in order to do that, we're going to have to talk about the event that finally broke her. Quote, "Until the age of 17, Julie had a doll. She had had this doll from infancy. She dressed and clothed it, played with it in her room. No one quite knew in what way. It was a secret enclave in her life. She called it Julie Doll. Her mother became more and more insistent that she should give up this doll, because she was a big girl now. One day, the doll was gone." End quote. We never actually find out whether Julie's mother did in fact take matters into her own hands and get rid of the doll herself. It does seem like something that she would do based on what we know about her. Though we also have to consider the possibility that Julie might have done it herself. Because it was after the doll went missing that Julie heard her first auditory hallucination, and this voice said to her that a child wearing her clothes had been beaten to death by its mother. Now we have to put all of this in context. Julie had spent all of her life being coddled into an existential crisis by her family, especially so by the mother. So her mother had become represented to her psyche as a kind of destroyer. It's part of her world image. Which is why when her mother scolded her for these outbursts and said that she was bad, she interpreted that at the level of her being as a form of murder. And just on a slightly tangential note here, I don't think that it's coincidental at all that phrases like character assassination exist. Because if we hear somebody spreading malicious information about someone else, what they're effectively trying to do is destroy the image of that person in the minds of the people that know them. They're trying to assassinate the old referential system and replace it with a bad referential system. So this language is telling. It's communicating something about the way that we see ourselves as a self. and that words can interact with that self and alter its foundation, sometimes with destructive results. So returning to this matter of the doll then, if the mother occupied the dual role of a destroyer and also as a kind of manager who regulated Julie's life, then when Julie entered into a role play with this doll, where she dressed it and moved it around, and was effectively the only subject-object relationship in her life where she had some kind of control, Julie was taking on the role of the parental influence which she had internalized in herself. Quote, "It seems highly probable that at this stage her mother for Julie was already more an archetypal destroyer than her real mother outside. When Julie said that her mother killed the doll, it is quite possible that she did so, that is, her internal mother had done so. However it happened, the action was catastrophic, for Julie was evidently closely identified with the doll. In her play with the doll was herself, and she was its mother. Now it is possible that in her role play she became more and more the bad mother who finally killed the doll. We shall see later that in her psychosis the bad mother acted out and spoke through her a good deal. If the doll had been destroyed by her actual mother, who had admitted it, the event might even have been less catastrophic. Julie's shreds of sanity at this stage depended on the possibility of being able to lodge some bad in her actual mother. The impossibility of doing this in a sane way was one of the factors that contributed to a schizophrenic psychosis." End quote. Now we know the significance behind the words, "a child had been murdered." Julie had migrated in life from an infant into an automaton, and from an automaton into a fragmented, bewildered schizophrenic. With the dawning of adolescence and the rejection of parental influence, the psychic system, once supported by external means, began to collapse in on itself. Something interesting starts to happen during psychotic collapse, because what we notice is that the self doesn't necessarily disappear, rather it fragments into various micro-identities, and these typically become adorned in the skins of other people which the schizophrenic individual knew in life. And what's more, they can take on multiple aspects. So for example, you could have a micro-identity embodying the sister, and that could be distinguished between a voice that spoke as the good sister and another voice that spoke as the evil sister. And to make things even stranger as well, the fragmentary effect of the psychosis cascades from the self-system into their language and behaviour. Remember, Julie got diagnosed with Hebephrenic schizophrenia, which is characterised by this intense disorganisation in thought and speech, and that emanates from an essential disorganisation that stemmed from the level of the self. So to paint a picture of it, you can have a Hebephrenic who's talking about making a bacon sandwich in one micro-identity, and halfway through the sentence, "I want to make a bacon sandwich," immediately shifts gears into another micro and starts reprimanding herself for being greedy. So the fragmentation is total. We'll exemplify this in the quote here. Quote, "Julie's self-being had become so fragmented that she could best be described as living a death-in-life existence in a state approaching chaotic non-entity. In her madness, there is no one there. She is not a person. There is no integral selfhood expressed through her actions and utterances. Incomprehensible statements are said by nothing. She has already died. There is now only a vacuum where there was once a person." End quote. Now, as morbid as all this sounds, we have to pay attention to the language that Lang is using. He's telling us that in her madness there is no one there. He's not saying that there is no one there at all times. Rather, in those moments of psychotic collapse, Julie falls into a total hebephrenic disorganization, and that gives way to a state of unbeing. And we have to sympathize with the difficulty that faces a therapist in this type of situation as well. The difficulty arises from having to parse out all of these different fragmentary micro-identities from each other and access what remains of the real self lost inside the labyrinth. As R.D. Laing writes, quote, Julie in her psychosis called herself Mrs. Taylor. It means I'm tailor-made. I'm a tailored maid. I was made, fed, clothed, and tailored. End quote. Another problem that arises with any kind of effort to reintegrate a divided self is that any partial restoration of the collapsed system can bring with it new dilemmas. As a therapist, they obviously want to help the subject to heal and reintegrate this broken self, but the challenge in having to distinguish between all of these different microsystems and the utter chaos of the hebephrenic communication means that this is a painfully slow process, resulting in many stop-start efforts. Here's another quote from R.D. Laing speaking about this in Julie's case. Quote, with Julie, it was not difficult to carry on a verbal exchange of any kind, but without her seeming to have any overall unity, but rather a constellation of quasi-autonomous partial systems, it was difficult to speak to her. She would sometimes marvellously come together again and display a most pathetic realization of her plight. But she was terrified of those moments of integration for various reasons, among others because she had to sustain in them intense anxiety, and because the process of disintegration appeared to be remembered and dreaded as an experience so awful that there was refuge for her in her unintegration, unrealness, and deadness. End quote. And that speaks to the tragic consequence of someone in Julie's position. It's the agony of having to go through that process of coming back to harbour and realising that you have an authentic self, only to experience that self melting back into the chaos of unbeing again. And that is an experience so painful that the patient might start to see the chaos as a kind of sanctuary. In other words, as hellish as it might be to live with, it might be better to be shattered and stay shattered, instead of continually going through the process of coming back together and falling apart. Through these revelations of the disintegrated self, we are effectively coming to an appreciation of how our psychic arrangement is integrated. One system overlaps with the other, affecting what the other is, and vice versa. Laing also says something really interesting here about how our sense of a consistent personal unity is maintained. Quote, personal unity is a prerequisite of reflective awareness, that is, the ability to be aware of one's own self acting relatively unself-consciously. End quote. Now that's really interesting. He's saying that it's not actually just in those moments where we can introspect and fall upon a consideration of ourselves as a self, to consciously recognize ourselves in the mind's mirror per se. It's also in those transitory, semi-conscious states where we're not really paying intense attention as well that orchestrates together into a consistent comprehension of being. That's quite a deep way of looking at it, because the psychoanalyst Lacan says that we experience ourselves as a procession of fragmentary moments that we order together into the illusion of a unified self. But what R.D. Laing is saying is that our sense of unified self is not simply granted by some post hoc jigsaw piecing together of disparate moments, but instead it's generated at a much more subtle level as an internally derived sensation of consistency, arriving in that moment-to-moment apprehension of ourselves throughout the day. And in the schizoid or schizophrenic position, that essential consistency is vaporized, giving over to an extreme amplification of the Lacanian model of mind, which is fragmented into these partial systems and dissociated from any consistent point of center. And what we find in the schizophrenic is that these partial systems seem to compensate for this fragmentation by taking on in themselves a semblance of that previously lost order. Listen to this, quote, "Each partial system seemed to have within it its own focus or center of awareness. It had its own very limited memory schemata and limited ways of structuring percepts, its own quasi-autonomous drives or component drives, its own tendency to preserve its autonomy and special dangers which threatened its autonomy. In Julie, each partial system could be aware of objects, but a system might not be aware of the processes going on in another system which was split off from it. For example, if, in talking to me, one system was speaking, there seemed to be no overall unity within her whereby she, as a unified person, could be aware of what this system was saying or doing." End quote. So in other words, the speaking system in Julie was dissociated from the system where Julie's attention was fixated, meaning that in her shattered experience she might hear a voice that was talking, but not recognize it as her own voice arising from her own body. And that's because this essential consistency that I was talking about has faded away, meaning that Julie can't properly distinguish a consistent model of self across all operations in her system. It's just a cacophony of various instruments playing at their own behest with no central conductor present to orchestrate them into a continuous composition of being. Alright, so let's do a little experiment. If you touch your hand and feel that sensation of your own flesh, we notice that there's also a corollary support system that unifies that into our sense of self. We know that this sensation is arising from contact with our own body, and that gives it over to a personal experience. It is an experience of ourself, experiencing it itself as an integrated part of the body and the nervous system and the brain and the consciousness. And if we speak to someone on Skype who is talking to us and we see them scratch their hair, that is still something occurring from our end at our level of consciousness. And because we're also successfully generating a consistent model of self across all of our systems, we can properly distinguish between what's going on in our private locality and what's going on with this other individual on Skype who's scratching his head and talking to us. There's a consistency at the level of the body and what the senses are giving us, and also at all levels of the self. And therefore, we know where we end and where the other begins. And so we can have a common sense relationship with it, as R.D. Laing says. But in schizophrenics like Julie, without a conductor to orchestrate a consistent symphony of self across all of the mind's systems, an unusual pattern starts to emerge where people lose the ability to form cogent distinctions between their own subject-object boundaries and the world. And so the world and the self get mixed up into this big confused soup, as it were. And this also goes for internal experiences as well, as we already mentioned. The body could be speaking, but the self is somewhere else, dissociated in a void, or within another micro-identity which doesn't recognize its own body. From the book, quote, "Instead of having a reflective awareness of those aspects of herself, she would perceive the operation of a partial system as though it was not of her, but belonged outside. She would be hallucinated." William Blake, in his description of split states of being in his prophetic books, describes a tendency to become what one perceives. End quote. You know, this is what I wanted to talk about the religious stuff. I always had this intuition, long before I even got into all of this stuff, that the spiritual experiences of mystics and shamans might have some overlap with the medical reports of psychotics. And now, as I've become more educated on the matter, I'm more convinced that this is the case. As part of our integrated nature, we possess this ability to form cogent distinctions between different types of category system: subject, object, man, animal, organic, artificial. And that's useful for obvious reasons, but there's also a blindness that comes with that, in the sense that we sometimes fail to see the overlap between different types of category system that have been split off from each other. And when we stop and consider them more closely, we sometimes find that they actually have a lot more in common, and maybe, just maybe, what we're doing is looking at the same system, but rationalizing about it in different ways, and that creates an illusion that these two types of category are different systems, when in fact they're the same system, simply being distinguished differently. Like, have you noticed that when we talk about the hallucinatory accounts of schizophrenics, where we hear about admonitory figures embodying parents or demons, we consider these things as forming part of a psychosis, and usually we regard that as something value negative. And then in another situation, you can go on YouTube and listen to Joe Rogan talk about DMT to one of his guests, where we hear about very similar things to what a schizophrenic tells us, but we treat that in a completely different way. And we might, instead of calling it a psychosis, we might use more neutral terminology like altered states of consciousness or self-transformation. And that arises from the fact that these psychedelic states are like holidays in schizophrenia, where we can experience psychosis under the reassurance that in a few hours everything will be fine again. But I ask this question: would we be so idealistic about these things if after taking them we had to be like that for an entire day? No, how about an entire week? How about a year? I don't think under those types of conditions we'd be quite so romantic. And I'm not trying to psychopathologize these kind of psychedelic experiences. That's not actually my real intent. What I'm trying to elucidate here is that there is a common overlap between these things, and I think that we're dealing with the same fundamentals, especially in the nervous system, that produce these types of experience, and the distinctions that we form between them are arbitrary. So when an artist like William Blake talks about becoming one with what one perceives, why do we consider that as something totally different than when a schizophrenic talks about their legs being consumed by the wall? I think it's made more confusing by artists as well, because artists possess this ability to beautify these things and make them seem even more romantic. I think about people like Alex Gray, who is actually someone who I have a lot of respect for, and I think his work is incredible. Though really, are the things that Alex Gray is vivifying in his work and talking about in this very romantic kind of new age language that he uses to describe his art, is that really so different than what a psychotic talks about? Than what a schizophrenic like Julie talks about? I don't think it is. I think that we're talking about the same fundamental things, though because we have this ability to experience these kind of states temporarily and then zoom out of them again, that makes us reconsider them in a totally different way. And here we've got books like this, The Divided Self, that talk about the terrifying consequences of being unbound from all restraints and given over to the wild landscapes of altered states of consciousness. These things are not to be romanticized. They can still be fascinating. They can still render insights into the workings of the human mind. They might even be beneficial in certain types of therapy setting. I'm willing to cede ground on all of those things. But don't get into some frame of mind that the psychological phenomena and the organic processes that underpin them are so far removed from when you take a drug into yourself. It's the same processes in the body, and it comes out in the same styles of language all the time, whether it's medical or whether it's spiritual. It's just we make different value judgments based on how we want to feel about it and how we want these things to work for us. Whereas I see it, madness is madness. And if you were to go mad for a week rather than a few hours, maybe you'd be feeling like this, quote, "In Julie, all perception seemed to threaten confusion with the object. She spent much of her time exercising herself with this difficulty. That's the rain. I could be the rain. That chair, that wall, I could be that wall. It's a terrible thing for a girl to be a wall. All perception seemed to threaten mergence, and all sense of being perceived by the other threatened her similarly. This meant that she was living in a world of constant persecution. Almost every act of perception appeared to involve a confusion of self with not self. The ground was prepared for this confusion by the fact that, since large aspects of her person were partially outside herself, it was easy to confuse those split-off aspects of her being with other people. Her confusion of her conscience with her mother, and her mother with her conscience. One of the simplest instances of the operation of a split of her being into two partial assemblies is seen when she issued herself an order and proceeded to obey it. She was doing this continually, either under her breath or out loud by hallucinations. Thus she would say, "Sit down, stand up," and she, the self that was she, would sit down and stand up. Or a hallucinated voice, the voice of another partial system, would issue the order, and she, the action of another partial system, would obey it. End quote. So after quite an extensive foray into this case and the psychological and existential ramifications of it, we're finally approaching the conclusion of this observation, and I'm afraid to say it doesn't have a very happy ending. R.D. Laing doesn't make any real indication that Julie ever recovered. All we have throughout the rest of the chapter are a series of statements from the divided system that communicate in a cryptic way all that remains of this calamity of a life. The psychic fibres of a girl once known as Julie had now completely collapsed into its foundations. Without a consistent, integrated sense of self and subject-object relationship with which to orientate properly to life, the higher mind gives way to what lies beneath, and the body begins to speak in the picture language of its hereditary past. I'm reminded of something that Jung said, that during states of semi-somnambulism, unconscious elements may seize control over the conscious psyche, producing automatisms of various sorts, hallucinatory visions, sensations or voices, automatic movements or writings. These automatisms, as Jung calls them, are always a part of us, and they're a crucial part of what informed the early years of this project, XELASOMA, and I suppose that they still do in a way since we're talking about them right now. It's just that in a cohesive symphony of selfhood, our psyche can properly filter and orchestrate these things together and do so well enough to make life bearable. Julie had no such luxury. She was adrift, constantly being teleported from island to island, suspended over a void of non-being. And to think that this could have been a girl with a future, who succeeded in all of the things her parents in their optimism wanted of her, and yet by their own failures, they succeeded in transforming something that came from the energies of their own life into a state of anti-life, an abortion in a vacuum. When I read the statements from Julie, or what was left of Julie, I want us to hold in mind that this is still a human that we have here. It's still a complex life form capable of articulating itself to life, albeit in a much more primitive sense now. All utterances of the body are some attempt to actualize the essence of the body to time, to let other beings around it know that it is there, and that it's experiencing something that it wants the world to hear. And this goes for a song as it does for all kinds of speech. For when we cry out in pain, it's not so much a word, it's more of a noise. But the point of making that noise is the body is still addressing something in sound. It's trying to communicate something that it wants the world to know, that it's desperate for the world to know. And just because something is cryptic or disorganized in its pattern doesn't mean that there's no meaning to it or it's absent of reason. Whether what was said by Julie's body arose of what remained of her true self or some dissociated aspect of her mind taking its place, we do not know. All we know is what was said. Quote, I was born under a black sun. I wasn't born, I was crushed out. It's not one of those things you get over like that. I wasn't mothered, I was smothered. She wasn't a mother. Stop it, she's killing me, she's cutting out my tongue. I'm rotten, base, I'm wicked, I'm wasted time. That child's bad, that child's wicked, that child's wasted time. That child's mind is cracked. This child's mind is closed. You're trying to open this child's mind? I'll never forgive you for trying to open this child's mind. This child is dead and not dead. She was born under a black sun. She's the Occidental sun. I'm the prairie. She's a ruined city. She's the ghost of the weed garden. Well, there it is. I told you it was going to be heavy. That's really the essential part of the video over and done with, but if you want to stick around and hang out for a while, I've still got a few things that I want to express about how this kind of subject relates to society. R.D. Laing believed that the insane were the victims of a society that saw itself as sane. And to me, I have to confess, I share some sympathy with that view. It's ridiculous to think that when a schizophrenic talks about themselves in a picture language as a lifeless machine, we automatically disregard their statements as nonsense, utter madness. But when a scientist like Richard Dawkins says human beings are just lumbering robots and that the world is just dead matter, we automatically yield to authority and regard that as a sensible statement of the facts. And we do all of that without stopping to even consider that the dissociated, alienated perspective that gives people over to describing themselves as machines might have some overlap to a mind that regards itself as sensible for thinking just that. R.D. Laing was, in this respect, following in the footsteps of Jung because, unlike some of his contemporaries, both men were some of the first people, really, probably since the ancient world even, to take the statements of the insane seriously. They didn't simply regard the so-called word salads as the product of a life absent of reason. They understood very poignantly that within the carnage of words and life history, there lay an existential truth that the fragmented life was trying to convey.
And the universal message of utterance, whenever a human life communicates anything, must surely be, I am alive, even when it's saying it's dead. Especially so when it's saying it's dead, actually. And probably one of the reasons why we can't decipher that, or we have trouble deciphering that so much, is because we've all been initiated into the world image of this culture, which has told us that nature is dead and mute, and that we are just complex machines, and that if you want to demonstrate to the world that you are a sensible and intelligent person, then that's precisely what you should believe. Yet if a schizophrenic tells us that he's dead inside and that he's a robot, oh no, that's a psychotic thing to say. Quick, lock him up. Medicate him for a few months and send him out of the asylums with a smile on his face, happy that he's found the strength to plug himself back into the architecture of the dead space machine mind society that's partially responsible for having made him that way in the first place. It's like the world image that we've chosen to represent life is in conflict with the way that we vitally experience life as an entity. And that's our existential schism. That's the division that we have to contend with. And really, like I said at the beginning of this video, when you come to think about it and understand the context of these things, part of the dilemma of the schizophrenic is not so removed from our dilemma as we'd like to think. We're still trying to actuate ourselves to life and demonstrate to the world and to ourselves that even within this toxic atmosphere that's constantly telling us that we're dead, and is always, have you noticed, offering us new ways to kill ourselves. It's a suicide cult. And people think the Aztecs were bad. Look at what we've got. So if we have to live inside of a culture whose highest proclamations declares us to be dead robots, then our solution is trying to find a way to actualize ourselves within that state. Within that cultural system, I mean. And to re-imbibe into our lives a sense of existential purpose and meaning that makes life bearable. That's our primary dilemma. And I don't think that that can come from the outside in, like from a guru or a self-help manual or a 12 rules for life even. And I don't mean to be cynical about that. I think that these things can be useful. But there's got to come a point where you graduate from that. And so do we leapfrog from system to shipwreck, trying to hold everything together? Maybe. Maybe that's all that we have. Or there might be something that we can find to cooperate with, to have a synergistic collaboration with, that generates some kind of mode of living that, like the bonsai tree, makes that innate vitality flourish from the inside out. Because one thing that we should all be able to agree on, the culture's not going to do it for us. This culture doesn't care about anything that brings the human spirit what it needs. It doesn't care about that stuff. And science isn't going to save us either, because they're death priests as well. So we have to manufacture the cure from within the poison of our own hearts, so to speak. Or we become like ghosts in the weed garden, slowly fading into non-existence. And if the rising suicide rates are anything to go by, I think that that's a grisly testament to what we have here. And I think that we need to harness this gift and freedom while we still have it, and use it constructively and not abuse it like the culture wants us to. I'm on about the internet and the information that we have and the leisure time that we have, the freedom that we have to actually do something with ourselves. we have to use the gifts of the machine to serve us. And that's what I'm trying to do here with these machines. It's an effort to try and what I consider to be a much needed restoration or a reconnection with a lost vitality. And I think I'm doing that as much for myself as I am trying to carry that over to people. And I think that a big part of that for me is really trying to understand what I am as a human, and on all levels, just biologically, psychologically, existentially, perhaps even spiritually. And it was my creative practice that initiated that all those years ago. That's been my system of collaboration and cooperation that puts me in touch with the foundation of my existence. And if I didn't have XELASOMA, I'd just be like so many other people out there. I'd just have a job, I'd be subsisting, and I wouldn't have anything vital. I wouldn't have anything organic that I can grow with. And maybe that's a privilege of mine, that I'm an artist and that I have that innate ability from birth to be able to create like that. Because I haven't created much else in my life. I haven't created a family. I haven't created a business empire or anything like that, and I've never been particularly interested in joining anybody else's enterprise. Not because I'm better than that, I'm not saying that at all. It's just I always knew I had to go down my own direction in life and find my own way, and this is the way that I've done it. Though I'm saying this because I realise that there are lots of people out there who aren't artists, and they're still trying to find something in their own way and in their own lives that can bring them something real, you know, not what the culture offers them, not what this death philosophy gives them, something real, something that makes them grow from the inside out, as I keep on saying. And yeah, I do consider a lot of what I do in XELASOMA, it's not just an interest, it's not just a nerdy project for me or a way for me to sell my wares. I mean, it's partially those things, of course. I do find this information interesting and I love making art and I like selling it. My next video after this one is going to be a time-lapse, by the way, of a new artwork that I've created. And I'm really, really happy with the way it's turned out. It's wonderful, actually. Though the higher purpose that I think that a project like this can offer is that it's got to be, like I was saying before, it's got to be something useful to people. It can't just be an intrigue, and it can't just be this word that I don't like. It can't just be content. It can't just be this disposable, momentary, throwaway things that we fill into the void of our lives while we're just waiting to die. I think that that itself, the content cycle of just constant acceleration and constant disposability, I think that itself, that cycle, that process is part of the nihilistic trend. And even though on one level I understand that I am a content creator, I don't want to tap into that. I want to offer things to people that's a bit more useful. And I think that as XELASOMA grows over the years, I think that that's going to be, well, I endeavour for it to be anyway, to be much more prevalent. And maybe after I die, there'll actually be a body of work in a multimedia format that's going to be useful to people and that's going to enlighten them against this false enlightenment that ever since its inception has always been the policy of divorce. We've had too much divorce, we've had too much division. We want restoration, we want roots, we want to grow up again to the sun and not the black sun. And in order to do that, we need to gradually go step by step up the temple and recultivate our relationship to life and how we regard nature and human nature itself. This is the essence of this project. It's a humanist project in the genuine sense, not in the other sense of people like Voltaire and the secular humanists. I mean in the sense of really learning about man and our relationship with nature, both within and without. That's what I try to do here. I want the people that I can reach in my life to remember that they're human and that they're not machines and that they have creation inside of them. They have the power of stars inside of them. They're a cosmos, and the cosmos is alive just like we're alive. And that's what we all believed. In the ancient world and in the medieval world, we thought that nature was alive. We thought that nature was like an organism, that it had a vitality to it. And then everything changed. And I don't think that the new model that we've got, for all of its brilliance and insights in many of its areas that I don't mean to take away from, I think that whatever it's contributed to our world, it has greatly impoverished our essential perception and relationship to life and the nature which it claims to take so much interest in. And so yeah, this video has been another step up the temple. We've learned about the integrated nature of our system. We've learned about the organic relationship of the family to the child and how that can go right or terribly wrong. And also I think that what we should take away from this is that language always points to something, that there is truth even in the most irrational chaos of a life. There is a truth being communicated, and that in order to receive that truth, in order to acquire that insight, we need to put ourselves in the right frame of mind to be able to decipher that truth. And we saw this when Julie spoke about herself as Mrs. Taylor, and she said things like, "I'm tailor-made." Well, all right then, let's take that on board and ask, what does a tailor do? Well, they fashion clothes and they fit them onto human bodies. Just like she did when she was playing with that doll in her room, and that doll was a configuration of herself in a way. At the essential level, this was a statement about the way that her life, the way that her mind ordered itself to reality. And it was desperate, just absolutely desperate, to communicate that her entire life had been fashioned by the hand of someone else. I'm tailor-made. I'm not a real person. I'm trying to become a person. I'm a lifeless doll. Yeah, that all makes perfect sense if you put yourself in the right frame of mind and become receptive to what the human is trying to communicate. And it's picture language. Picture languages. Language and pictures are inseparable. If they were gods, they'd probably be siblings because they stem from the same life and they reflect each other. And it's the pictures that people speak in that often convey more information than the intellectual convolutions of abstract theories, which reify us into a rigid, frozen, robotic position about things. It's then when we become like machines. And isn't it funny how the people who so enthusiastically insist that we are machines are so calcified within their own specialized view of things? And in order to break that calcification, we need dynamic thinking. We need dynamic ways of thinking to comprehend dynamic systems like nature and the human mind. And I'll say this in closing. If you want to make society safer from the negative effects of irrational behavior, what you don't do is suppress the irrational and call it demonic. If you want to protect yourself from a world of chaos, then you give the children of chaos their due, like the Greeks did, and you offer them a shrine or a place in society where people can go and find a vehicle with which to express the irrational out in themselves, so that the irrational can have a voice and say, yes, I am alive, instead of just being buried and castigated all the time like what we do in our culture. And R.D. Laing was right. We live in a society that sees itself as sane and rational, and yet within our society, irrationality and insanity reigns. I do wonder if there's any relationship. Maybe if we had a more dynamic philosophy of life and of human nature and of psychology for that matter, then we'd live in a world where the dynamism of human life could be truly accounted for. Maybe we'd be a lot more healthy for that. But since we all just want to place all of our eggs in just a few baskets, that means that then that which we suppress comes back to haunt us. A sane society is not created through appeals to reason. It's cultivated through accommodating the insane within us and allowing the human to speak in all its voices.